The summer of 1462, the most powerful man alive stops his horse and cannot move. Not from an arrow, not from a blade, not from anything that soldiers are trained to defend against. He stops because of a smell that hits the column like a physical wall, thick, sweet, rotting, wrong, in a way that bypasses the thinking mind entirely and speaks directly to something older and more animal, something in the body that recognizes death on a scale it has never been asked to process before. Sultan Mehmed II has conquered Constantinople. He has toppled Byzantium. He has redrawn the map of the known world with cannon fire and mathematics and the cold patience of a man who has never once doubted that history belongs to him. He has ordered massacres. He has watched cities burn. He has stood in the nave of the greatest cathedral in Christendom and declared it a mosque while the bodies of its defenders were still warm in the streets outside. Nothing has ever made him stop. Until now, the scouts at the front of the column have gone still. The officers behind them have gone still. And as the Sultan's horse crests the hill above Târgoviște, the capital of the tiny, impossible, maddening principality of Wallachia that has refused to submit, that has refused to pay tribute, that has refused to behave the way that things in the path of empires are supposed to behave, Mehmed sees what the smell was warning him about. A forest, but the trees are not trees. They're human beings, 20,000 of them, lifted into the air on wooden stakes arranged in perfect geometric rows that extend to the horizon in every direction. Concentric circles, star patterns, ordered lines, a grotesque architecture of suffering that covers 2 miles of ground and half a mile of width. Some have been dead for weeks. Their bodies are bloated, blackened, collapsing into themselves in the summer heat. Others are more recent, and some, God forgive whatever world produces this, some are still alive, still moving, still making sounds that carry across the entire field. At the centre of it all, on the tallest stake, wearing the remnants of his military uniform, is a man Mehmed recognizes, Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman commander, a man Mehmed sent into Wallachia on a diplomatic mission months ago and never heard from again. He is positioned deliberately, precisely, intentionally, facing the exact route of the Sultan's approach, looking directly at Mehmed across the distance. A dead man delivering a message on behalf of the man who put him there. Mehmed stares at this for a long time. His chroniclers record that he was silent for several minutes. Several minutes is an eternity for a man of his temperament and schedule. Around him, hardened veterans, men who have stormed walls and waded through the aftermath of siege warfare. Men who have seen what human beings do to each other when cities fall, are vomiting in the dust of the road. Some are deserting in the night, rather than advance another step into a country that produces this. When Mehmed finally speaks, the words his chronicler records are not rage, they are not disgust, they are something far more unsettling. It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who has done such great deeds, a man who knows how to put his power to such use. A man like this is worth much. That is not condemnation. That is recognition. That is a conqueror acknowledging that he has encountered something he does not fully understand, something that has taken his own methods, the methods of the empire he built, the methods he perfected across a lifetime of expansion, and done something with them that even he could not have imagined. Within days, Mehmed orders the retreat. The most powerful army in the world turns around, not because it lost a battle, not because it ran out of weapons or men or supplies, because a man with a fraction of its resources and none of its institutional power reached inside the minds of its soldiers and broke something that swords and arrows could not have touched. That is the story you are never told about Vlad the Impaler. Not the monster, not the vampire, not the madman drinking blood from the skulls of his enemies. The real story is colder than any of that. More patient, more calculated, more human, and therefore ultimately far more frightening. This is the story of how a broken 11-year-old boy became the most sophisticated psychological warfare strategist of the 15th century. How the empire that made him into a weapon forgot to account for the possibility that weapons learn. How a man with no army worthy of the name turned the darkness that had been poured into him by his captors into the exact instruments that would one day force those captors to turn around and go home. Welcome to Cursed Eras. We don't tell you what history wants you to think. We tell you what history was actually doing while you weren't looking. Stay with me. The year is 1442. Vlad is 11 years old, and his father is about to sell him to an empire. Vlad II, known as Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon, named for the chivalric order of the dragon to which he belonged, rules Wallachia from a throne that has never been entirely stable. Wallachia sits between two powers that regard it primarily as a buffer zone and a tax revenue source: the Ottoman Empire to the south and east, the Kingdom of Hungary to the north and west. Every prince of Wallachia since the principality's founding has spent his reign navigating the impossible geometry of satisfying both powers simultaneously while being fully trusted by neither. In 1442, Vlad Dracul's navigation has reached a crisis point. The Ottoman Sultan, Murad II, Mehmed's father, has demanded proof of loyalty. Not promises, not tribute, proof, living proof, the kind that can be locked in a room. The arrangement is clear and brutal in its clarity. Vlad II will retain his throne. In exchange, he will deliver 2 of his sons to the Ottoman court as hostages. Insurance, collateral in the currency of human beings. If Vlad II ever defects, switches allegiance, fails to pay tribute, or in any way inconveniences the empire, the sons die. Vlad, the future impaler, 11 years old, and his younger brother, Radu, 7, are taken from their home and transported south into the heart of the Ottoman world. The history books, when they mention this at all, tend to move past it quickly. The boys were well treated. They received education, military training, religious instruction. They lived in the palace at Edirne, later in Egregius. They were not chained in dungeons. By the formal standards of hostage arrangements, theirs was relatively comfortable. This is where the history books reveal their fundamental misunderstanding of what damage actually looks like. Comfort is not the relevant variable. Control is the relevant variable. And from the moment Vlad's feet left Wallachian soil, at age 11, every single aspect of his existence was controlled by men who had purchased that control with the implied threat of his death. He was fed when they chose to feed him. He slept where they chose to house him. He was educated in what they chose to teach him. He wore what they provided. He spoke the languages they taught him. He learned the faith they instructed him in. He existed entirely and without exception within a container built by other people for their purposes, and the walls of that container, however gilded, were absolute. This is not education. This is the systematic replacement of oneself with another. And Vlad, 11 years old, then 12, then 13, watching it happen around him and to him and through him, understood exactly what it was. His younger brother Radu did not resist. Radu adapted. He proved gifted at the languages, charming in the social rituals of the court, genuinely likeable to the people around him. He formed a friendship. Accounts suggest it became something more intimate than friendship, with Mehmed Murad's son, the future conqueror of Constantinople. Radu became, over the years of their shared captivity, something the Ottomans could use. He was the hostage who had transformed successfully. The proof of concept, Vlad refused. Not noisily, not dramatically, not in ways that would have gotten him immediately killed. He was intelligent enough to understand the boundaries of viable defiance. But in 100 smaller ways, constantly, consistently, he refused to complete the transformation. He refused to forget where he came from. He refused to stop being what he had been before the container closed around him. Ottoman court records, fragments of administrative documents, aides' notes, the kind of bureaucratic detritus that accumulates around any sufficiently complicated human situation, record that he was frequently punished for insubordination. The exact nature of those punishments is lost to history, as such records tend to be. The pain inflicted on powerless children by powerful systems rarely gets its own archive. What the records do preserve, in the careful language of people writing about things they would rather not examine too closely, is that something in Vlad's psychology during those 6 years did not bend. It broke, and then it reformed into something different, something that had incorporated the breaking into its structure, the way bone heals thicker at the fracture site. Every execution he witnessed, he studied. Not flinched from, studied. He watched the way the Ottoman system used public death as an administrative tool. He watched how the placement of a body, the manner of a killing, the staging of a punishment could accomplish things that armies alone could not. He watched how fear, applied with the right precision to the right audience, could govern a population more effectively and more cheaply than any garrison. He watched the empire's masterclass in psychological management, and he took notes. He also watched something else. He watched the empire's weaknesses, the things it did by rote, by habit, by the institutional momentum of a system that had been running long enough to mistake its own methods for natural law. He watched where the machinery assumed, where it stopped checking, where its confidence in its own power had calcified into a blindness about what people on the other side of that power might be learning from the experience. He was building something, not consciously perhaps, not at 11, not at 13, but the way a body builds immunity, through exposure, through suffering, through the slow, cellular accumulation of knowledge that no formal education was going to provide. In 1448, after 6 years, Vlad returned to Wallachia. He was 17 years old. 2 months later, his father was assassinated. The boyars, the Wallachian nobility, that class of political survivors who had outlasted a dozen princes by the simple strategy of betraying each one at the optimal moment, had done it. His father, Vlad Dracul, the man who had sold his sons to buy his throne, was killed by the same men whose loyalty he had purchased with that sale. His older brother Mircea was taken, blinded with hot irons, and buried alive. Vlad was 17, alone, without allies, without resources, without a throne, surrounded by the men who had killed his family, backed by nobody. This is the moment where most histories begin treating what follows as the origin story of a monster. The trauma explains the cruelty explains the legend explains the centuries of vampire mythology that Bram Stoker would eventually crystallize into its final form in 1897. But that reading misses the point entirely. What Vlad did in the years that followed was not the expression of a broken mind. It was the expression of a very precise and very functional one. He did not become violent and erratic. He became patient. He waited 6 more years, in exile, in poverty, in the company of people who had no reason to trust him and considerable reason to fear him, studying, planning, mapping the political landscape of a world that had given him every reason to hate it, and no reason whatsoever to expect fairness from it. In 1456, with the military backing of the Hungarian governor John Hunyadi, Vlad seized the Wallachian throne for the second time, and immediately demonstrated that he had not spent those 6 years in exile simply waiting. The coronation feast of 1456 should be understood not as an event that reveals Vlad's madness, but as the first public demonstration of a strategic doctrine that he had been developing for years. He invited the boyar families to a celebration. He had them arrive in their finest clothes, reassured by the ordinary rituals of political normalization. Wine was poured, food was served, the great hall was decorated, and then Vlad stood up and asked a question. "How many princes of Wallachia have you personally lived through?" The boyars answered with visible pride. 7, 10, a dozen. They were bragging. They were telling him, in the language of political survival, that they'd spoken their entire lives, that they were the permanent class, the ones who endured while princes came and went, the kingmakers behind the kings, the actual power in a principality that had never managed to produce a ruler who lasted long enough to threaten their preeminence. Vlad listened. He smiled. Then he gave an order. The boyars who had answered were arrested. Not all of them. Not randomly. He had already sorted them in his mind. The older ones, the ones who had been present for his father's assassination, the ones whose hands were most directly on the machinery of that betrayal, were taken outside the palace walls and impaled before the feast had ended. Their screams were audible in the great hall. He did not stop the music. The younger ones, the ones healthy enough to be useful, were stripped of their fine clothes and marched 50 miles north to the ruins of Poenari Castle. There they were given a choice that was not a choice: rebuild the fortress with their bare hands or die. They hauled stone up a mountainside for months. Their noble clothes rotted from their bodies. Their hands bled. Most of them died during the construction. The ones who survived were not the same people who had arrived. This was not rage. This was not the explosion of a traumatized young man finally given power over the people who had wronged him. This was a surgical restructuring of Wallachia's political ecosystem. He had identified the class that made strong central authority impossible, the class that had made his father weak, that had made every Wallachian prince weak, that had sold the principality to whatever external power offered the best deal in any given season, and he had removed it, replaced it with people who owed their survival entirely to him, and who understood, with the clarity that physical extremity provides, exactly what the price of disloyalty would be. He didn't want obedience from fear alone. Fear fades. Fear can be managed and navigated and worked around by sufficiently motivated people. What he wanted was something deeper: the total psychological restructuring of the relationship between ruler and ruled. He wanted people for whom obedience was not a calculation, but a reflex, for whom the alternative to compliance was not an abstract threat, but a visceral memory living in the muscles of their hands and the scar tissue of their knees. He had learned this from the Ottomans. He had watched them do exactly this on a larger scale, across multiple territories. He had studied how they used the spectacle of punishment to govern populations far beyond the immediate victims. He had understood that a single impalement witnessed by 100 people creates 100 people who will carry the image for the rest of their lives, who will describe it to their children, who will feel it again every time they consider doing something that might put them on the wrong side of the man who ordered it. He had learned the lesson completely, and now he was teaching it. But the boyars were a domestic problem. What came next would demonstrate whether the lesson had a wider application. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, the same Mehmed who had shared a palace with Vlad's brother Radu for years, who had watched young Vlad refuse to bend while Radu adapted, who now ruled the most powerful empire in the known world from the capital he had conquered at the age of 21, sent envoys to Wallachia. The message was standard imperial maintenance. Wallachia owed tribute. Vlad's father had agreed to pay it. Vlad, as his father's successor, was expected to honour that agreement. Additionally, Vlad was expected to present himself personally in Constantinople to renew his oath of vassalage. To kneel, in other words. To acknowledge in person, in public, in the capital of the empire, that the small principality he ruled existed at Ottoman sufferance. The envoys who carried this message were experienced diplomatic professionals. They had delivered similar communications to dozens of client rulers. They expected negotiation, perhaps delay, possibly a counteroffer involving reduced tribute amounts. What they did not expect was what they got. They arrived at Vlad's court and refused, in accordance with Ottoman religious custom, to remove their turbans before the prince. This was not insolence, it was protocol. It was the ordinary practice of Ottoman diplomats everywhere they went, an expression of religious identity that had been accommodated by courts from the Balkans to the Danube without particular incident. Vlad received the explanation of this custom with apparent thoughtfulness. He nodded. He said, "I respect a man who honours his faith with such absolute dedication." Then he told his guards to nail the turbans to their skulls, not to kill them. That is the crucial detail, the detail that separates this act from a simple execution and places it in the category of communication. He gave specific instructions. The nailing was to be done in a way that would not be immediately lethal. The envoys were to survive the procedure. They were to be released and sent back to Constantinople. They were walking messages, screaming, bleeding, permanently disfigured walking messages, carrying in their bodies the literal text of Vlad's reply to the Sultan's demand. The message read, "I have taken your symbol of authority and made it a wound. I have turned your religious custom into an instrument of your suffering. I have demonstrated that I know exactly what your protocols mean to you, and I can make that meaning into a weapon. Come and get me." When Mehmed received his envoys, men he had sent in good faith, professional diplomats now returned to him mutilated and driven half mad by pain and shock. He understood immediately that this was not an act of impulsive cruelty. An impulsive, cruel man would have simply killed them. This was something calculated, something that had absorbed the Ottoman language of symbolic violence and spoken it back with a fluency that should not have been possible from a Wallachian prince with 20,000 soldiers and no strategic advantage whatsoever. War was now the only possible response. Mehmed began assembling his army. While he did, Vlad sent more messages. In early 1462, before the main Ottoman force had crossed the Danube, Vlad led a winter raid deep into Ottoman-controlled territory south of the river. He moved fast, he moved at night, he moved with a brutality that had now been refined through several years of practice into something methodical. When it was over, he wrote a letter to the King of Hungary, his nominal ally. The letter was partly a request for support and partly, reading between the lines, something else. A record, a documentation, a proof. In the letter, Vlad provided a body count. He listed the number of people killed, categorized by age and gender. He included the names of villages and the approximate numbers from each. The total was over 23,000. He kept a body count. He categorized it. He sent it to an ally not as an apology or an explanation, but as evidence of his own effectiveness. This is the signature of a mind that experiences its own actions primarily as data, as information to be processed, recorded, and deployed in the service of a larger strategic narrative. By spring of 1462, Mehmed's army had crossed the Danube. Conservative estimates put it at 60,000 men. More aggressive estimates reached 90,000. Even the lowest credible figure was more than triple the entire military-age male population of Wallachia. This was not an invasion, it was scheduled erasure. Vlad had perhaps 20 to 25,000 men. A significant portion of them were peasant conscripts, with minimal training, fighting because Vlad had made the consequences of not fighting sufficiently clear. A conventional engagement would have been over in an afternoon. Mehmed expected an afternoon. He had conquered Constantinople in 53 days, and he was allotting Wallachia considerably less time than that. What Mehmed had not accounted for was that Vlad had no intention of fighting a conventional engagement. As the Ottoman army crossed into Wallachia, they found a country that had been systematically emptied. Villages abandoned, fields burned, wells poisoned. Every source of food and water that a large army moving through territory depends upon had been destroyed by the people, who lived there under the authority of a man who had made the costs of non-compliance viscerally clear. The forests and mountains were full of Wallachian civilians and their livestock, watching the Ottoman columns pass through a landscape from which everything useful had been removed. Ottoman supply lines, already stretched by the distance from their bases, began stretching further. The army that had been designed for a rapid conventional campaign against a conventional opponent found itself in a dead country, moving through silence, unable to forage, unable to replenish. Then the nights got worse. Vlad had spent years training specialized units in what would now be called guerrilla tactics. Small groups, 50, 100 men, who operated at night, who moved through terrain they knew intimately, while their pursuers knew it not at all, who had a single operational objective that was not to win engagements but to make the larger force feel that every shadow was dangerous. They hit supply wagons. They killed sentries. They stampeded horses. They set fire to ammunition stores and vanished before a coordinated response could form. Night after night after night. The psychological effect on a large army of constant, unpredictable, nocturnal harassment is well documented in modern military psychology. Sleep deprivation, hypervigilance, the exhausting and corrosive suspicion that the enemy is everywhere and nowhere, that any darkness might contain something that will kill you before you understand what happened. Mehmed's veterans, who had stormed the walls of Constantinople with ladders and cannon, found themselves flinching at shadows in a Wallachian forest. And then, on the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad did something that no military commander in his position had any business attempting. He attacked the Sultan directly. He had extracted from captured Ottoman soldiers the location of Mehmed's personal encampment within the main force. He assembled 10,000 men. He had them dress in captured Ottoman uniforms. He made sure enough of them spoke enough Turkish to create confusion in the chaos he intended to generate, and in the deep hours of the night they walked into the Ottoman camp. What followed was described by witnesses as absolute, total, ungovernable chaos. Vlad's men set fire to tents, drove horses through sleeping soldiers, and moved with a single objective that they pursued through the burning and the screaming: find the Sultan's pavilion and kill the man inside it. They came, by multiple accounts, within yards of Mehmed himself. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite personal guard, the most professionally effective soldiers in the world at that moment, formed a defensive ring and held. They held, barely. Vlad could not break through. He ordered the retreat. His men dissolved back into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared. The Ottoman casualties from the raid were, in military terms, modest. Perhaps 2,000 dead, not strategically significant for a force of 60,000 or 90,000. But the military calculation entirely misses the point. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, in the centre of his own army, surrounded by his own guards, had nearly been killed by a man who had no right to come that close. The largest army in the world had been made to feel that it was not large enough, that its size, its professionalism, its organisational superiority, none of these things had prevented an enemy from walking into the heart of its camp at night and almost reaching its leader. The soldiers who had been sleeping were not sleeping anymore. They would not sleep easily again for the duration of this campaign. Every night in that country was now a night when it might happen again. The darkness was not safe. The camp was not safe. The Sultan himself was not safe. And then they crested the hill above Târgoviște and smelled what was waiting for them. The forest of the impaled had been months in the making. Vlad had not improvised this. He had been collecting people for it, Ottoman soldiers taken in skirmishes, local people suspected of collaboration, prisoners from the winter raids, enemies of various categories accumulated over the preceding year. He had kept them alive, deliberately, specifically, for the purpose that he now put them to. To understand what he built requires understanding something about impalement that is not generally known, something that the popular image of a stake driven straight through a torso gets exactly wrong. A stake driven straight through the torso kills quickly. Quick death is not what Vlad was engineering. Based on the descriptions in Ottoman, Wallachian, and Byzantine sources, and on subsequent medical analysis of those descriptions, his method was designed with a precision that is almost incomprehensible to consider. The victim was laid face down, the stake carefully selected, carefully shaped, rounded at the tip, thoroughly oiled, was inserted at a specific angle, calculated to miss the major organs and blood vessels. The victim was then raised upright, and the stake was fixed in the ground. Gravity did the rest. Over hours, over days, the victim's own body weight drove the stake gradually upward through their torso. The path was designed to avoid the heart, the lungs, the major arteries. People survived this for up to 3 days. Why? Why this extraordinary investment in the technical management of how long it takes a person to die? Because Vlad understood something that modern psychological research has since confirmed. Witnessing prolonged suffering is exponentially more traumatizing than witnessing quick death. A beheading is over in a moment. The image is terrible, but it is finished. The mind can eventually integrate a finished image. A field of 20,000 people in various stages of a 3-day dying process cannot be integrated. It cannot be filed away. It cannot be processed and moved past. It sits in the mind like something alive, because parts of it are alive, and it does not stop. And the staging was not incidental. Vlad had designed this display with the same attention to visual communication that he brought to everything else. The stakes were different heights depending on the rank of the person on them. Peasants near the ground, local soldiers higher, captured Ottoman officers higher still, and at the centre, at the apex, on the tallest stake, positioned facing the specific route by which the Sultan would approach, Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman commander who'd been sent to Wallachia months ago, dressed in what remained of his uniform, looking at Mehmed across the field of his own armies dead, the concentric circles, the star patterns visible from elevated ground, the geometric precision of the rows. This was not the work of a man who had lost his mind. This was the work of a man who had understood something profound about the relationship between visual information and psychological collapse, and who had spent months engineering a specific sensory experience for a specific audience of one. Every element of that field was a sentence in a letter addressed to Mehmed personally. The height hierarchy said, "I know your system, I know your rankings, I have reproduced your order in my terms." The geometric precision said, "I have so much control over this situation that I can impose aesthetic organization on suffering at this scale." The positioning of Hamza Pasha said, "I know where you will stand, and I have arranged for the first thing you see to be one of your best men looking at you." And the sheer scale, the smell, the sound, the 2 miles of it in every direction, said, "I have been preparing this for you for months. I have thought about you constantly while you were thinking about me not at all. I know you are coming. I have been ready." This was a message from a man who had spent 6 years in the Ottoman court, watching how an empire communicates power. He had learnt the grammar, he had learned the vocabulary, and now, with 20,000 bodies arranged in geometric patterns across 2 miles of Wallachian summer landscape, he was writing back. The message was, "I am not afraid of you. I have taken everything you taught me about terror and I have exceeded it. Come forward if you choose, but you have already seen what I do to the men you send ahead." Mehmed, to his credit, and to the credit of his historical reputation, did not pretend to misunderstand the message. He looked at it for a long time. He said what his chronicler recorded. He ordered the retreat. The Ottoman army, 60,000 soldiers or 90,000 soldiers, the most powerful military machine in the world, withdrew from Wallachia. Not because Vlad had defeated it, not because he had inflicted casualties sufficient to compromise its operational capacity, but because the man commanding it had encountered a mind that operated outside the parameters that military mathematics could model, and had made the correct calculation that the costs of continuing to advance were not primarily military. They were psychological, and psychological costs, unlike military ones, are not recoverable on a battlefield. You cannot resupply morale with a supply convoy. You cannot reinforce shattered sleep with reserve units. You cannot bring in fresh psychological resources to replace the ones that have been consumed by 2 weeks of nocturnal raids followed by 2 miles of impaled men in geometric patterns. Mehmed left Radu, his old friend, Vlad's younger brother, the one who had bent rather than broken, in command of a harassing force, and withdrew with the main army. The most powerful force in the world retreated from a principality smaller than some of its individual provinces. History records this as a strategic withdrawal necessitated by supply difficulties. That is the official language. The honest language is, a broken 11-year-old boy had become a man, and the empire that broke him had finally encountered what it had made. But here is the part of the story that the legend consistently fails to tell. Because the legend, whether it takes the form of monsters or heroes, has a common interest in stopping at the triumph. Romania celebrates Vlad as a national hero. There are statues, tourist merchandise, a whole industry built around the idea of the prince who stood against the empire. And in the narrowly military sense, the narrative has a point. He turned back an empire with a fraction of its resources, using nothing but terrain and psychology, and a willingness to go further than anyone expected. What the legend omits is what happened next, because what happened next is the actual lesson, the one that cost Vlad everything and that nobody talks about because it undermines the clean narrative of the brilliant strategist. What happened next is that Vlad discovered he had only one tool. After the Ottoman withdrawal, he did not put down the instrument he had forged. He could not. He applied it to Wallachian merchants who charged prices he considered unfair. He applied it to boyars he suspected of disloyalty based on information that may or may not have been accurate. He applied it to villages that failed to meet his standards of behaviour. The forensic precision that had made him effective against the Ottomans became indiscriminate at home because he had never developed, had never been given the conditions to develop any other way of solving problems. He had learned one lesson, magnificently, completely. He had learned how to weaponize fear. He had never learned how to govern without it. His political position deteriorated with extraordinary speed. Radu, backed by Ottoman resources and Ottoman patience and the political capital of his long association with Mehmed, positioned himself as the sane alternative to his increasingly unpredictable brother. Hungarian support, the backing of King Matthias Corvinus that had made Vlad's return to power possible, evaporated as it became clear that supporting Vlad required endorsing methods that were difficult to justify to the European courts that Matthias was also trying to cultivate. By November 1462, 4 months after his greatest military achievement, Vlad was a fugitive. He fled into Hungary and was imprisoned by the ally who had helped restore him to power. The charges were murky. Some historians believe Matthias fabricated documents showing Vlad had been negotiating secretly with the Ottomans as a pretext for imprisonment that was really about managing an asset that had become a liability. Others think there was genuine substance to the accusations. The truth is probably that it didn't matter. Vlad had made himself impossible to work with, and when you make yourself impossible to work with, people find reasons to stop working with you. He spent 12 years in Hungarian captivity. Comfortable captivity, house arrest in decent quarters, a Hungarian noblewoman who became his wife, children born in those years. But captivity. The man who had turned back the Ottoman Empire at the height of his powers sat in comfortable rooms in a foreign country and waited for the wheel to turn again. In 1476, it turned. Wallachia had cycled through several weak rulers in his absence, and the combination of Moldavian and Hungarian interest in stabilizing the region created an opening. Vlad was restored to the throne for the third time. He had perhaps 2 months. In December of 1476 or January of 1477, the exact date was not preserved, which tells you something about how quickly it happened and how little documentation survived it. Vlad was killed. The circumstances are disputed in every source. Some say he was killed by his own men in the confusion of a battle, either through treachery or through the chaos of night fighting, where nobody could clearly identify who was who. Some say he was overwhelmed by an Ottoman force near Bucharest. The one consistent element across all the accounts is that he did not have time to build anything before it ended. His head was cut from his body. It was preserved in honey, the Ottoman method of long-distance transport for proof of death deliveries and sent to Constantinople, to Mehmed, the man who had turned his army around on a hillside 14 years earlier, was presented with the head of the man who had built that hillside, floating in honey in a container, displayed publicly in the capital that had once been the greatest cathedral in Christendom, and was now the seat of the empire that had made Vlad into the instrument that had once nearly killed its sultan. Vlad's body was allegedly buried at Snagov Monastery, on an island in Romania. When excavations were conducted in the 1930s, the tomb was empty. Nobody knows where he actually is, which is, in its way, entirely appropriate. The man who left 20,000 bodies arranged in geometric patterns across 2 miles of landscape so that they could be found and would be found and could not possibly be missed, has himself not been found. The man who engineered visibility as a weapon is invisible. The man who made the most powerful army in the world stop and look left no verifiable trace of where his own remains ended up. History did to him exactly what he did to everyone else. It made him unfindable. The Dracula mythology began accumulating almost immediately after his death. German pamphlets produced during his lifetime, some of the earliest mass-produced illustrated texts in European history, a technology that was brand new in the 1460s and 1470s, had already established a repertoire of atrocity stories, some verified, some not, all of them circulating with the speed that a new printing technology makes possible when the subject matter is lurid enough. Bram Stoker encountered this material 400 years later, combined it with Carpathian folklore about the undead, and produced a novel in 1897 that turned the name Dracula, Vlad's family name, meaning son of the dragon, into the definitive modern template for the vampire. The supernatural monster is, in a specific and important sense, easier to think about than the real one. A vampire is something from outside the human world. It is not of us. Its capacity for harm derives from its fundamental otherness. It is dead. It is unnatural. It operates by rules that do not apply to human beings. When we are frightened of a vampire, we are frightened of something that could not have come from the same place we came from. Vlad the Impaler came from the same place we came from. He came from a specific childhood, a specific captivity, a specific set of experiences that were inflicted on a specific child by specific adults, operating a specific system. He came from human decisions made by human beings, pursuing human objectives. He was, in every relevant sense, produced. He was a manufactured outcome of a process that someone designed and someone implemented and someone maintained, and the people who designed and implemented and maintained it did so because it served their institutional purposes, and they never asked what they might be creating in the mind of the child who was experiencing it from the inside. That is the horror that the vampire myth allows us to avoid, because if Vlad is a supernatural creature, if he is something fundamentally other, something that cannot be understood through the ordinary categories of human psychology and human decision-making, then we do not have to ask the question that his actual story forces us to ask. We do not have to ask what else has been produced this way. What other children have been placed inside? What other containers, by what other systems, in the service of what other institutional purposes? And what have they been learning while they were in there? The Ottoman Empire produced Vlad the Impaler in the same way that a factory produces a product. It took raw material, a frightened, defiant, highly intelligent 11-year-old boy, and it subjected that material to a 6-year process designed to reshape it into something more useful. The process did not work as intended, but the process did work. It shaped him completely. It simply shaped him into something the factory had not ordered, because factories are not good at predicting what happens when the material refuses to become the product. What it produced instead was a man who had absorbed the factory's methods so completely that he could reproduce them without the factory's resources, who had studied the machinery of fear so thoroughly that he could build a version of it from local materials with a fraction of the budget, who had learned at the Ottoman Empire's feet that terror properly applied could accomplish what armies could not, and who then demonstrated this lesson to the Ottoman Empire itself, at a scale and with a precision that left its sultan standing on a hillside in the Wallachian summer, unable to move. The forest of the impaled was not an act of madness. It was a dissertation, a 20,000-body dissertation submitted to the most powerful institution in the world, arguing a single thesis. I learned what you taught me better than you intended. Mehmed understood this. That is why he did not respond with rage. That is why his recorded words were recognition rather than condemnation. You cannot deprive a man like this of his country. A man like this is worth much. He was acknowledging, with the only currency available to him in that moment, that he had met his match. Not militarily. Militarily, the empire remained overwhelming, but psychologically, tactically, in the specific dimension where Vlad had chosen to fight, the student had exceeded the teacher. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy, whatever else it is what that mastery cost him. Because the same total commitment to a single method that made him effective against the Ottomans made him impossible in every other context. He could not scale down. He could not modulate. He could not deploy a different tool when the problem did not require this one. The boy who had been shaped into a weapon had become only a weapon. And weapons are not good administrators, not good politicians, not good allies. They are good at the one thing they were made for, and destructive applied to anything else. He died in a skirmish in an unglamorous December, beheaded by someone whose identity was not clearly established. His head sent to the man he had spent his life fighting, his body unrecovered, his location unknown for 5.5 centuries and counting. The empire that made him outlasted him by 440 years, and yet his method worked. Against every reasonable military and political calculation, his method worked. The most powerful army in the world turned around. The Sultan, who had never retreated, retreated. The forest of the impaled stood in the Wallachian summer and accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. It broke something in the minds of the men who saw it that all the military mathematics in the world could not repair. What does that tell us? What do we do with that? The easy answer is nothing. The easy answer is that this is history, that these events are 5.5 centuries behind us, that the Ottoman Empire is a museum exhibit, and Vlad the Impaler is a theme park vampire, and that the lessons of the 15th century Wallachian campaign have no particular relevance to anything we need to think about. The uncomfortable answer is that the question Vlad's story asks has not become less relevant with time. What happens when systems designed to break people produce something they did not intend? What are the consequences across the full arc of a life and a career of inflicting formative damage on a mind that refuses to submit? What does it mean that the most effective tool for stopping an empire turned out to be something the empire itself had created? These questions do not have easy answers. They did not in 1462, and they do not now. But they are the questions that Vlad's actual story, not the vampire, not the Romanian national hero, not the madman, but the documented historical human being who spent 6 years learning from an empire how to destroy it, insists on asking. And at Cursed Eras, we believe those are exactly the kind of questions worth sitting with. The forest of the impaled has been gone for 5.5 centuries. The stakes rotted, the bodies dissolved into the Wallachian soil. The geometric patterns that Vlad spent months arranging exist now only in descriptions and chronicles, and the field notes of historians trying to reconstruct what was there. But Mehmed stopped his horse, and for several minutes he could not move. That happened, and the mind that made it happen was made, in turn, by another mind, in a palace in Edirne in the 1440s, working carefully and systematically on a frightened 11-year-old boy who refused to bend, not understanding that the refusal to bend was not the material's flaw. It was its nature, and nature, when it cannot be broken, learns. If these are the kinds of stories you come here for, the ones that don't end cleanly, that don't resolve into heroes or monsters, that insist on asking the question underneath the question, then stay with us. Subscribe to Cursed Eras, because we are just getting started on the chapters that the official histories decided were too complicated to include. History's darkest rooms are not dark because nothing is in them. They are dark because someone turned the light off deliberately. We are here to turn it back on.